Welcome to the Learning Can't Wait podcast, a Full Mind production. At Full Mind, our vision is to ensure every child has access to an exceptional education. Each episode, we will be joined by pathfinders within and around the education space who are bringing about transformational change on behalf of deserving students. I am your host, Hayley Spira-Bauer. Welcome back, everybody, to the Learning Can't Wait podcast. We have a guest on today that I first talked to about joining the podcast nearly 3 years ago when we first started. So long awaited and so excited to finally have her here to talk about her work, what she's excited about in the education space, and just share a lot of wisdom. So we have Vriti Saraf, the CEO and co-founder of Ed3 DAO. Vriti, welcome.
Thank you for having me, Hayley.
I am so eager to get into everything that you are doing at Ed3 DAO, but also just talk about your journey in education. I know it is a fascinating one, and I look forward to our listeners hearing all about it.
Sure. So do you want me to start with the journey or start with
well, we'll start I have the same first question every time. So the question does get you into the journey. You can interpret it how you want. It's how did you come to be the personal and professional version of yourself?
Gotcha. I would say similar to a lot of kids who grew up in the 80s and 90s, schooling just didn't do it for me. I was very disengaged and I went to school to see my friends, but not quite to learn. So I never learned how to learn really. And the first time I learned how to learn was when I was 21 or 22 and I joined Teach for America. And the only reason I joined Teach for America, by the way, was because I didn't know what else to do with my life. And somebody that somebody that I had dated had gotten kicked out of the program. And I was like, wow, I wonder how hard this program is. Let me try.
Can I get kicked out too? No. Wow.
Yeah. And so I literally applied because I did not know what else to do with my life. And I miraculously got accepted. And when I started the program, I had no idea what I was in for, but what ended up happening over the 2 years was I ended up developing my sense of self and sense of persona as a learner. And I never actually I don't think I really was consciously a learner in my younger years. I don't think as I said, learned how to learn. But when I was a Teach for America teacher, I finally understood the value of education and the value of understanding who you are as a learner. And that fundamentally changed my life and who I am today. That's really, like I would say, Teach for America was like the first pivot point that really brought me to who I am today. And of course, I, drank all the Kool-Aid and will never leave the education industry because I'm so committed to, equity and sort of access to education. And so I did Teach for America. Then I was a teacher for a bit at that same charter network. I was a dean for a bit. Then I helped them sort of grow from 2 schools to 15 schools in Brownsville, Brooklyn. And we developed a dean development program and a residency program and all that kind of stuff. But throughout that entire journey, I would say like the most important thing was I was focusing on adult development. And it made me understand that adults have so much capacity to learn and change and grow, which is not something that I realized earlier on. And that is really what sort of propelled me to doing what I am today and being who I am today.
That is really interesting. I love how you realized who you became who you were as a learner by being a teacher. I wonder, I wonder, like, do you recall what light bulb moments you had about you as a learner when you were a teacher?
You know what it was? I think this has to do a lot with grit and growth mindset. So before I became a teacher with Teach for America, I often approach things with the perspective that if they're too hard, I will quit. So I didn't have a lot of resilience. I didn't have a lot of grit. In fact, my parents, who, were very, very overprotective and very sort of helicoptery, were encouraging me of like quitting because they were like, well, we don't want you to be in distress or pain. We want you to live an easy life. And so like I grew up, thinking that, well, it doesn't matter if I complete things. It doesn't matter if I, do things that, are difficult, things like that. And with Teach for America, I didn't have a choice because if I quit, then I had 30 kids who would suffer if I quit, right? So it was the first time where I actually had responsibility over other people, and I couldn't let them down. I couldn't, just walk away from something just because it was hard. And Teacher America was really hard,
Yes.
right? As you know. And so that I think is really what, helped me develop that mindset, which is like the grit part, the growth mindset part, and really being able to understand that, like, you know, if you're doing these sort of difficult things, not only are you ensuring that the people around you are able to rely on you, but also you're able to sort of like grow as a human. And the way that you saw your kids developing over the course of a year, you saw yourself developing over the course of a year, right? So my first year as a teacher was a hot mess, and then my second year as a teacher was a complete 180, right? It was just, all the kids from other classes that were, having trouble maintaining their discipline, whatever, would be sent to my class. I started off with 28 kids in the beginning of the year, and then at the end of the year, I had 32 kids, so it's
Yeah.
like they were just like, that my second year just became this sort of like huge sort of development moment for me. And I saw the difference between my first year and second year. And that sort of like being able to see your own growth over a short period of time is just mindset changing, right? It really helps you see like how much humans can grow. And I think that's one of the biggest like misconceptions that adults often have, which is they often say people don't change, or I can't change, or I can't grow, or I can't get myself out of a situation, or like my job sucks and this is what I'm going to do for the rest of my life and blah, blah. And it's like, I think that sort of fixed mindset is really what holds people back. And I think if you can see yourself grow and develop, then that just changes everything.
I have like an image in my head of what you're talking about here, right? So I have pictures of my first year classroom and second year classroom after I set it up. My first year classroom had like stuffed animals everywhere, like really cutesy pictures everywhere, which by the way, all got destroyed in like the first 3 weeks because I did not know how to manage a classroom. My second year classroom had clipboards for behavior management with student names where they kept their own data where these are second. I taught first and I looped to second, and then they added a whole bunch of students to my class, as you talked about. And they managed their own behavior charts, they managed their own academic growth charts. Like literally everything was data driven, led by students, which was an obvious visual of the change between that first and second year. So I can like picture it. It is fascinating to me what you say about grit and growth mindset. I think in a lot of ways, it was a new concept when you and I were both going through the core for Teach for America. And a lot of ways, education kind of overcorrected this grit and growth mindset situation. And even Carol Dweck herself, the creator of growth mindset, has said, I actually don't know if I can curse on this podcast, but we've kind of ruined, there's another word I want to use, but I won't use it. We've kind of ruined how I intended this to be implemented in students. Have you heard that pushback that she's given? And like, what would you say now, given that you've had this direct experience yourself into how it's being implemented in schools and education settings today?
Yeah, I've heard that critique of grit for sure, because I think the way that it's been critiqued is that it doesn't take into account students' lived experiences and the context behind how they're, operating in life, and the sort of like backgrounds that they have. And it's a little bit of a privileged thing to sort of like talk about. With the growth mindset, I haven't heard that critique, but I can see how overcorrection can definitely be an issue, because I think with especially the charter world, which is where, most Teach for America teachers spent their time. We at first focused on like no tolerance models and sort of like very rigid models where, especially like, schools like Success, or, other sort of like models that are like focusing on college bound and everything. So I can see how that overcorrection can happen. I think what you said about your classroom the second year, where the kids were sort of like agentic and they were able to sort of like manage their own work and time and things like that. I think that's really where the magic happens. And I think that's where schools are starting to realize like that's what they need to over-index on. So right now, if we say like, we want to teach kids how to, embody the growth mindset or embody grit, I think we're doing too much hand holding, and we're actually sort of like doing too much guidance and sort of like linear engagement instead of allowing kids to sort of explore those concepts on their own, which is why I think charter schools are often finding that the kids are very successful in the school itself, but then when they go off to college, they're not able to survive on their own because they don't have, a teacher sort of like, holding their hand and guiding them through that process. And so I think the what I would say about, the growth mindset piece is growth mindset has to come hand in hand with agency. And if agency, and so does grit. And I would say if we can create systems in our classroom and instill the value of agency and sort of like allow kids to be able to make their own mistakes and make their own decisions and be able to like, they're at their own developmental speed, sort of like attain the mindsets of grit and growth mindset, then I think that would sort of avoid any of the over-indexing because every kid would be able to sort of like, move into agency through those concepts instead of sort of focusing specifically on those concepts.
Yeah. I'm going to switch us a little bit because you mentioned in your introduction that Teach for America was your first pivot point, which means there were more. So what was the next pivot point and how did that change your path?
Yeah, so I spent 10 years in Brownsville, Brooklyn, and it was an incredible experience because I got very close with the community. I really understood the struggles of low-income students and of the obstacles that we often experience when sort of like attaining education, all that kind of stuff. But my world was very much like Brownsville, Brooklyn for 10 years, right? Like that's all I knew, and it was the charter world was all I knew. So then the next pivot point happened when I actually moved into a startup that was building independent schools around the world. And so the goal was to start 30 schools around the world, and we ended up starting two schools, one in Shenzhen, China, and one in DC. And I was the global head of professional development, and so I actually got to travel around the world, learning from best school models, and spent a lot of time in China, spent a lot of time in India and Europe and the US learning about like what's out there. And I had never known until then a concept like Reggio Emilia existed, right? Which is crazy because I spent 10 years in education and I didn't even know that that pedagogy even existed. And so
Yeah.
when I started learning about Reggio Emilia and then Montessori and about, phenomenon-based learning and project-based learning and emergent curriculum and all that, it just completely changed my perspective about what kids are capable of and how we can actually develop systems for kids that are, much more human and much more aligned to how they should be growing through sort of like developmental needs and then just, through the environment, all that kind of stuff. And so that really changed my perspective. That was like a huge pivot point for me. And I realized that there's so much out there in the education space that most educators just don't know about. And there isn't enough connection points between educators globally where they can actually teach each other and learn from each other. And then the other thing that I learned through that experience was no one in education was using emerging technology. And I was sort of like a techno enthusiast from the get-go. And I've been sort of like, really into like, I'm a first adopter of a lot of technology. And I'm very like interested in learning about like what's going on in the ecosystem. And when I learned that, other industries are benefiting so much from emerging tech, but education just isn't, it just sort of was a light bulb in my head where I was just like, okay, well, educators are doing incredible things around the world, but they're not connecting with each other. And they're not using emerging technology in ways that are actually furthering the profession and furthering the industry. And so there needs to be a way for them to connect with each other. And that's when I started my first venture, which was K20, that led into what is now Ed3 DAO.
I remember when K20 launched. This is when we
Yeah.
first met. And I remember you had a major event. First of all, you were doing a lot of educating for educators about some of this emerging technology, which I'd love for you to talk about in a minute. I remember watching your videos and being like, I just don't even understand some of these topics. Like, is this for me? And it was for me, it was for everyone. Uh, let's dive into that a bit because I think there's stages here. There's what you were talking about occurring when you started K20, but then there's also this rapid proliferation of media intervening on tech creation and tech adoption today. Like Ed Week right now, I think is doing a weekly series where they survey thousands of educators on their AI acceptance and implementation in classrooms. And it's like, it's a hockey stick, like, right? You're seeing this adoption of, I wouldn't say it's emergent anymore, it's emerged. But I am curious because I do think you have been at the forefront of some things that didn't go hockey stick, and probably have a really interesting perspective about that.
Yeah. Well, I have a lot to say about what you just said. So I have a lot to say about AI in terms of like adoption and the way that educators are actually adopting this and the sort of TLDR there is I don't think it's the right direction. But we could talk about that later. But let's go back to the emerging technology that we started with. So we started with Web3. We started with blockchain and AR, VR, and we really wanted educators to understand the opportunities that are out there that they could leverage in order to create more engaging classrooms that are more relevant to students. And here's the thing with blockchain, right? Blockchain is an underlying infrastructure that is quite difficult to understand and difficult to access for the layman. And so when we started educating people about blockchain, but we did it in a way where where we wanted folks to understand the principles behind it and not necessarily the technology. So for example, like if you're using your phone, you don't understand how your phone actually works. Like you don't understand all the chips inside of it, all that kind of stuff, but you know how to actually like leverage it in order for it to be useful to you. And so that's what we were trying to get people to understand, which is like you don't need to understand the ins and outs of blockchain, but you do, it would be beneficial if you understood, why blockchain is so important. Now, with blockchain, the hype has been around cryptocurrency, which is one use of blockchain. And that cryptocurrency, because it's so volatile and because there's so many bad players in it and there's so many scam artists, that's one of the reasons why it has sort of fallen out of the spotlight for educators, especially because educators obviously are, anybody is obviously wary of like, we don't want to be scammed into things. And so with blockchain, like there's a lot of potential and a lot of utility, especially with the combination of AI, but it hasn't gotten the spotlight or it hasn't continued to get the spotlight because cryptocurrency, which is one utility of blockchain, is what's getting all the spotlight. So obviously with the new administration, that's going to change, but that's another conversation for another time. But yeah, so I would say like the thing about blockchain is we still deeply believe in the decentralized and sort of self-sovereignty nature of it. And we still believe in blockchain for things like micro-credentialing, for things like data ownership, for things like even with AI, understanding like what's real and what's not by putting on a blockchain so that it's immutable and isn't like replicable and corruptible. Like all of those things I think would be really helpful to the AI movement actually. But we totally understand that educators aren't quite like ready to dive into it because the direct utility isn't quite there yet. We are exploring projects around micro-credentialing and sort of what's called a learner employment record, which is basically like a digital resume that lives on chain. So that's something that we're actually actively pursuing. But other than that, we like are putting sort of a little bit of a hold on that.
So
AR,
are you,
VR, yeah, go ahead.
no, I was gonna say, are you disappointed? Like, do you feel like this high potential pathway just, I mean, disappeared before your eyes, like as a viable source for, I mean, not completely disappeared because you're obviously naming methods in which you're using it, but what you thought it could be, is that disappointing to you? Or are you like, how do you feel?
So here's the thing, the visibility in media to the masses is very different than how it's actually being invested in and actually used. So blockchain and the Web3 world is still getting more investment than any other technology aside from AI. And it's still on the forefront of many, many industries' minds, and it's still sort of being used in a lot of different ways. It's just not in the spotlight anymore because AI has taken the spotlight. So I don't think it has actually like declined at all. I think it's actually
Okay, cool.
pretty
So my, yeah,
steady.
that's
Yeah.
fair. I mean, I think I told you right before recording, I was like, cool. You said like, ask me anything. I was like, cool. Cause I just read an article that's like Web3 is dead. Should we bury it? And you're like, you're telling me, no, actually investments are still high in this space. It's just not getting the same media headlining, which we could talk about that again on a whole other episode, that AI is.
No, that's
I
exactly
stand
right.
corrected.
Yeah, so Web3 isn't dead actually. It's actually continuing to sort of like, and if you think about if you understand what Web3 is, which is basically the evolution of the internet, it was never like manifested in the first place, right? Like it's
Sure.
going to take time for us to create a decentralized ecosystem where everybody can access the web. Like that's what Web3 is. That's going to be, years from now. But I would say the movement towards Web3, I think has been the hype around it is definitely been decreased, but it's also like now much more niche and it's focusing specifically on the utility of blockchain in different industries and different concepts, as well as AR, VR. AR, VR is still, being explored in a lot of different ways, and it's actually becoming more popular among homeschooling and microschooling and universities that are trying to create simulations for, workforce. All those things are actually increasing. So it's just that, AI is really sexy right now and everybody wants to talk about it, but that doesn't mean the other things aren't happening still.
Sure. I really appreciate you calling out a couple different ideas here, including AR, VR. Dr. Messina Morris from Morehouse has
Yeah.
been on the podcast twice. And I mostly have her on kind of like you so I can learn. Like, I'm like, this is not an area I feel expert, proficient, etc. I know that if I'm interested in learning more, I want my guests to feel that way too. Like, I think there is a certain audience that tunes into the Learning Can't Wait podcast that's really school based and like in the now. As much as we want to talk about the future, there's a lot of practicality in learning what's a tool or a strategy or an idea that's happening elsewhere that I can implement here and now. Whereas the conversation you're having and Dr. Morris are having are also like you said, we're building roads. These roads are not finished. And in some years' time, we'll have more deepened understanding as a society, but also more application potential.
Yeah, and I think that's actually a really great segue into AI because
Yeah,
AI
let's
right now
do
is
it.
being experienced on both spectrums. So the
Mm,
one spectrum that you named is like, how do we survive right now? Right? How do we just continue to what we're doing, but do it in a way where like teachers aren't burning out, where, teachers actually, have the capacity to be able to like, provide instruction that's of quality, all that kind of stuff. So that's like one way. And in my mind, what's happening and what I've observed is that's really about maintaining the status quo. And I understand that like, how that might be both problematic, but also like just the reality where educators just like need to just survive, right? Because the burnout rate is just so intense. And then on the other side is like, how are you actually using AI to enhance a profession, to enhance the field, to actually take it to the sort of like next level of like, transformation? And so like those two are unfortunately not balanced perspectives of AI right now. I think there's more maintaining the status quo than there is sort of like advancing. And so that's one of the things that we're really like thinking about. Like as you said, we have the privilege to be able to talk about and think about and do things that are like more on the forefront and building roads and not necessarily maintaining the status quo because we're not in the classroom. And that is a very like wonderful privilege to have, but it's also, I completely understand that that's separated from the reality of like the everyday teacher.
and someone needs to do it, right? Like, as I think because I'm adjacent to AI and the movement that's happening right now, and I'm a consumer of technology and I'm using it in my everyday work, and I'm interviewing people all the time who are deeply embedded in this. My observation is that we got thrown into the development of a new technology that really disrupted conversation. I will say conversation and not necessarily practice because the data tells us that it didn't actually disrupt teacher practice for a couple months. There was a lag. There was a lot of hype, a lot of conversation, but disruption didn't really happen. And now, as you're saying, it's still super surface level. It's
Yeah.
almost like we need people to tell us, like us being teachers, we need people to tell us, like, cool, here's where you are. It's like scaffolding. Here's where you are. Here's where you can go. What you need to do to get from, where you are to where you're going. Somebody needs to design and develop that.
No, that's exactly right. And here's the thing, it's actually much closer than we think it is, and it's actually much easier to access than we think it is. The biggest problem I'm seeing with AI is actually in the low-hanging fruit and the easy access, and then
Can you
also
give
the
some
AI
examples of
trainers.
that?
Sorry?
Can you give some examples of that? Like, what's an example of something you think's low hanging that we're
So a
missing?
low-hanging fruit is like using ChatGPT to generate a lesson plan, right? Like that is a very low-hanging fruit. Like that's the first thing that AI trainers who are claiming that they're experts because they know how to use ChatGPT. Like that drives me crazy, Haley. Like somebody saying like I am an AI guru or I am an AI expert because I know how to use ChatGPT or I've been using it for 6 months. It's like that is does not make you an AI expert, but fine. And so that's the low-hanging fruit. And what a lot of trainers are doing because it's such a new technology and because it's so easy to access, I think they're they're creating PDs and they're creating experiences for teachers where teachers experience these tools and they're like, wow, this is like such a quick sort of, this is like such a great way to save so much time. And that sort of emotional feeling, that sort of like success and that instant gratification is what I think AI trainers are sort of banking on and making a lot of money off of in these trainings. And they're just like, yeah, we'll teach you how to like save so much time. Like we'll teach you how to use ChatGPT and Magic AI and all that kind of stuff to like, do your assessments and provide feedback to students and like all that kind of stuff. But the problem there is that even if it is exposing educators to new technology, it's not teaching them the right habits that are actually going to improve their quality of instruction. And that's like one of the biggest problems. And so when I say that it's actually easy to move forward from that, the thing that I mean by that and the thing that we're doing is we really need to embed it in pedagogy, right? So it's not about, hey, here's a tool, an AI tool that will teach you how to like develop a lesson plan faster. It's more like, hey, are you implementing project-based learning? Let's go through the PBL cycle and let's actually find very purposeful moments where you can actually integrate an AI tool that will help you actually enhance your practice of PBL and then actually use AI in a broader and more purposeful context. And so like that is the shift that needs to happen in order for us to be really purposeful with this technology. But right now what's happening is, like let's be real, like a teacher who doesn't know how to lesson plan well is going to do it faster with AI, but it's still going to be garbage, right? So it's like we have to help educators like understand the fundamentals of the pedagogy first before they actually embed AI into their practice. But it's too easy, right? It's too easy to access, and AI trainers are just like, yeah, let's do it, and it's basically creating these bad habits that are again maintaining the status quo and not actually improving the profession.
I Before I do every podcast, I put my guest name in like as part of my prep, and I'm like, give me a little bio of this person. I go on LinkedIn, I do a couple different sources, and Vriti, when I put your name in this morning, it literally said Vriti Saraf works at Full Mind, and then gave my bio, and I was like, I literally wrote back, no, you have the wrong person. You've actually used my bio. And I was like, here are some blurbs about Vriti. Like, go search better. Like, silly example, but I use it often to just like validate and verify conversations I'm about to have. It's easy and it is not perfect.
Yeah. No, it's not perfect. And I think one of the things that I've been talking about for a year now is how AI compares to the cognitive abilities of humans. And I think that's one of the things that we really need to understand as teachers, especially for ourselves, but also for our students. And so last year I mapped AI to Bloom's taxonomy. And, Bloom's has gotten a lot of, controversial sort of discussion about like whether it needs to be linear or spiral or whatever, but
Yep.
like regardless, it's still like a pretty solid sort of cognitive framework. And so what I when I was mapping it, what I learned was that at the very bottom you've got remembering, and obviously AI is way better than humans at remembering because it can hold trillions of pieces of data. But then when it gets to understanding, which is the second level up in Bloom's taxonomy, AI falls apart. And it's for the same reason that you couldn't get the appropriate bio for me is because AI isn't making meaning, right? AI is basically taking the data that it has and creating some algorithmic connections and basically like spitting out a pattern for you. And it's not actually like creating any sort of like, evaluation or judgment or meaning making that humans can actually do. And so you were able to very quickly say like, no, that's actually not Vriti, that's actually my company. Whereas like AI wouldn't be able to do that if they didn't have the right data set, right? It didn't have the right data set. And so that's one of the things that we really need to understand because are you familiar with the concept of logical fallacies?
Yes.
So
Well,
what
like explain it for me like I don't know it. Go ahead, please.
So basically, logical fallacies are like flawed arguments that use like invalid reasoning, right? And so with AI, oftentimes we'll over-index on the response if we think that it's right, and then we'll continue building on that response by prompting and sort of like continuing to get more data from it. But the problem is, if you're starting from a false starting point, and that logical fallacy is called a false premise fallacy. If you're starting from a false starting point, then every conclusion you're making after that starting point is also false, right? And so with AI, that happens quite often where you're like getting a response. And let's say it named a different company, right? And it wasn't your company and you didn't recognize it. And you were like, that could be right. You basically start asking it more questions. And now it's building an entire profile that is completely
Sure.
wrong, right? And so like that making meaning and that understanding is what's really important for us to do. And from our perspective at Ed3, we really think the meaning making should happen from the pedagogical context.
Yeah, I'm thinking about the extrapolation of this as it relates to how we next teach kids, right, about technology, emerging technologies, AI. I've had a couple people on talking about graduate programs and how they can be teaching teachers to be teaching students. All of our careers are going to be drastically. My kids' careers. I have an 8 and a 5-year-old. Their jobs might not even exist today. The ones that they wind up pursuing. How do you? I'm going to ask this as my final question because we are nearing the end of our time. And tell me if you like this twist on it because I ask a similar question at the end of our episode, but I'm going to twist it for you based on what we've talked about here and kind of the logic path I'm taking. But what advice would you give teachers and even like graduate programs who are thinking about the careers that don't yet exist that are based on this emerging technology? I'm going to use your term about teaching kids. Like, how do they prepare students for a world that hasn't yet been built?
Yeah, I'll answer this in two ways. I'll answer this from the perspective of my organization at Ed3, and then I'll answer this from the perspective of a mom to be.
Yeah,
And so,
love it.
from the perspective of the organization, I think if we know that there is, evergreen research-backed pedagogy that really works for kids, right? Like if we think about like the Reggio Emilia, the Montessori, the PBL, the phenomenon-based learning, the UDL, restorative practices, design thinking, all these frameworks like have worked for ages and have actually developed really great ways for people to think about things that are, very critically and very sort of, in sort of like an overview that really like helps you understand like the world at large. And so I think one of the things is like, yes, you should use technology because you need to keep up with, the world around you, but embed that technology into the pedagogy and really understand how that technology is really helping you move the pedagogy itself, right? So embed, the use of your AI in the specific context of the empathy stage of design thinking, or in project development and PBL, or in, understanding real world context and phenomenon-based learning. So if we can make sure that educators are understanding this sort of like pedagogy, then I think it's going to be a much easier sort of like not a much easier, but a much more purposeful and a much more effective way to use technology. So that's sort of like from the organizational perspective.
Can I jump in there for 1 second?
Yeah.
It reminds me of the conversation that I used to have with teachers about teaching division differently. Like, don't just teach the kid to do the steps you taught them. Like, they have to understand the foundation.
Yes.
It just reminds me of that. I don't know why it's like it's not anything groundbreaking, but I remember the conversation so well. And now I have my own kid going through it. And he's like, Mom, just show me the steps. I'm like, no, dude. Like, you have to understand what division
the
means
fundamentals,
so that you can thrive long term.
It's exactly right. If you understand the fundamentals, then you can definitely, understand how to apply that context to anything.
Yeah.
In fact, one of the things that we all often talk about at our organization is, in order for students to be agentic and critical thinking and fulfilled, we also need to make sure teachers are agentic, critical thinking, and fulfilled. And the PD that's being offered to teachers is very different than what they're expected to teach in the classroom. So if we're wanting to teach fundamentals to students, we need to teach fundamentals to teachers as well. So that's sort of, a really important thing that needs to happen that like just isn't right across the board. So that's the organizational perspective. From my mom to be perspective, because I have a month left until I produce a baby girl. The thing that I've been thinking a lot about, because I've been in education for over 15 years, is like, what kind of education do I want to provide my kid? And the truth is that schooling is only as effective as the experiences that the student has with their teacher and the activities in it, right? So it's like, it doesn't matter if it's a public school or private school or charter school or whatever it is, as long as, there's a caring teacher in the classroom, as well as like activities that are sort of like pushing certain competencies. And the competencies that I have identified that I want my kid to have is actually pretty limited. I want my kid to have critical thinking, right? Critical thinking is probably the most important competency that they could have, because it doesn't matter if they're studying math or literacy or social, whatever it is. Like, if they can critically think about those concepts and be able to apply them to different things, then they are going to be invincible, essentially, right? They're going to be able to do and learn anything, right? That's the first thing. The second thing is self-awareness. So being able to understand and reflect on who you are, what you know, how you know it, and how you learn best. Those are the things that will actually allow students to be able to have more agency. And the third one is social awareness. So being able to understand and empathize with people around you, and being able to understand like what the world is, right? So those are the three things that I think if we continue focusing on, like critical thinking, social awareness, self-awareness, those are, I think, the most important qualities that we can embed into education.
Vriti, you have been so incredibly awesome to talk to. I already have 7 more episodes in mind that I want to have you back to do. Thank you so much for educating me and our audience about so many topics, and just for being so unabashed about where we are, where we need to go, and how you're working to do that.
I appreciate that, Hayley. And I love listening to your podcast, so I really appreciate being here.
Thank you. That's so kind of you to say. And maybe one day soon you'll be listening to it with your little girl. Congratulations.
Yeah.
I'm so excited for you to have a kid. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in. And we'll be back again soon with another great episode. Thanks for listening to the Learning Can't Wait podcast. If you like what you heard, please rate, review, and share this episode. Be the first to know when we have a new episode by subscribing wherever you listen to podcasts. If you'd like to be a guest on the show or have a suggestion for an episode, email us at podcast@fullmindlearning.com.